Hey everybody, welcome back to DJ Tutorials. We're going to be taking a little bit easy today and we're going to be looking at some new updates for Radeon ProRender for Blender. And even if you're not using it for Blender, this is a really good update to show you some new stuff that they're working on. So if you have been following along with ProRender, you'll know that this renderer has been going over a lot of changes over the last couple years, and they've basically rebuilt the entire API from the ground up. So there's some really great stuff in here, and I'm going to just kind of talk about some general stuff that's going on and show you some things inside of Blender. So all the web pages that I'm going to be looking at here, I'm going to provide links down in the video description, so make sure that you check that out afterwards if you want to download it and everything else. But if you go on here, you'll see that there's this version they call 3.2 for Blender. Basically, what it's actually called is 3.4. So this new release is an official release. It's not a development build, and there's a lot of stuff that has been changed. So let's just take a really quick look at some of the features. And I'm going to be talking about some of the problems and, whether or not I think you should be using this for production or whatever. So I will talk about that in a bit, but let's just go over some of the new features here. So you can see here that support for 3.1 and 3.2 has been added. So before, you couldn't really use the official release with later builds, and this provides support for that. So that's pretty great. It's officially supported now by these instead of just using the weekly builds. Some shadow receiving, and here's a really good one right here, this atmosphere and fog and the world properties. This is actually really, really neat. It separates out some atmospheric stuff and some volumetrics. So I will show you what that looks like in a bit. So just be patient for that, and I'll talk about that very, very shortly. One of the other things is that there's this interactive mode, and if you've been following along with ProRender's builds over the years, you'll notice that quite a bit has changed from my first videos to now, and they're always updating and changing a lot of stuff. But basically, instead of the low, medium, and high, and all that kind of stuff for the rendering, there's an interactive mode and a full render mode with a lot of different passes that you can look at in the viewport. So I'll be talking about that as well, just because it's important to know the difference of what these are. There's a noise random seed pattern, which is really great. And let's see, the secondary UV, which is a big ask that's been going on because sometimes people want different UV sets for different types of things. So that's a pretty cool thing. Now, in the fixes, there are still some problems, and I will talk about that kind of when I start showing you my file and all that kind of stuff. But there are some really good fixes here. You can see that motion blur has been fixed. Some things with IES lights and atmospheric volumes has been fixed. And just some like general stuff here has been updated to make it work a lot easier and a lot more of what we expect when we are going between cycles and ProRender. So a lot of these fixes are really, really, really great, and I think that that's fantastic. That being said, there are some problems still, some pretty major bugs that need to be addressed before I can really say that this is full on production ready. So I will be talking about that when we start looking at the project file. So if you follow the link down below to where you can download this, you'll see here that there are a couple different things. So if you're using Mac, whether you're using the ARM or ARM API or the regular Mac OS, check that out. So, make sure that you download the right stuff, or Windows, which is what I have. Download it, make sure that it is working on your computer. So if we start up a new file, this is just the default settings here, and we go over and after you install it, obviously, hopefully you know how to install it. You can check out some of my earlier videos for help on how to uninstall it and then reinstall it. But, turn on your Radeon ProRender as far as the engine that you're using, and make sure that you have the right render device. And when you first turn this on, it's going to take a minute to sort of load the API and everything. So just keep that in mind. For me, it's really quick. We already have it, rendered, and it's already doing some stuff. So that's something that you just have to be patient for. When it starts up, you'll see a little wait thing show up. But let's change a couple things. The defaults that I have, it sets some of these things to stuff we really don't want because it actually causes problems, in my opinion. So the denoising and the upscaling, to me, these sort of slow things down a little bit. And if we take the preview samples and sort of turn it down to like 16 or 32, things should move a little bit faster. So let's turn this back on. So you notice here that I set this to minimum of 16 and max of 32 for the viewport over here, and I've turned off viewport denoising and upscaling. I've just noticed that when it comes to the default settings, this allows a lot more ease of moving around within the scene. And if you kind of like move around a bit, you'll notice that it updates quite a bit faster than it used to in older builds of ProRender. It's definitely come a long way from when it was first using this new rendering system. Now, one thing that they've added is if you go up here, you can see it says render quality final. You can change this to interactive. And if we change that, you can see that it's actually much faster. It's more easy to move objects around and just sort of see what's going on in your scene. Now, that being said, things like volumetrics and some of your materials may not look exactly the same as your final quality, but it's really cool because you can actually build out a scene using this interactive render quality. And you can render it out with that setting if you want to just keep things really, really small and easy and quick to render. You can actually set those render properties for your final, and that can save you a heck of a lot of time. Now, let's go over to the world settings. And if we go to the world here, we can actually change this to sun and sky. So you have something like if you open up Unreal Engine or Unity, you kind of have this sort of sky setting, which is it's okay for, certain things that you're doing, but I don't necessarily recommend that for realism. So let's actually open up an HDRI of an environment, and there we go. And we can set the reflection, or sorry, the background override. We can set this to a black, and that'll make it to where we can focus on our objects right here, and we don't have to look at that background. So that's pretty cool that we have all these overrides here. But let's do a couple things. So I'm just going to add a plane, scale it up a bit, and you'll see that there's no material, so it's pink. And I have the materials library installed, which you can get from the link that I will also provide in the description below. But we can choose something like, let's do, I don't know, let's do something like this one here, just for fun. And we'll move this up like this. And let's choose a different material. Let's make this a glass. And you can see that now it's set, and we have, some quicker settings where things are being rendered much faster than the final quality, and you can actually render this out like this quality if it actually works out. Now, there are some things that aren't working with materials, and there's some really weird stuff that you'll have to deal with if you're going to render in this view, but it is really nice to have something that's easier to use for people who don't have super high powered computers and everything. So, I'm going to talk about a couple of the positives before we get to some of the could be better stuff that makes it a little bit difficult to use. So, I'm just going to open up the materials panel, and we are going to just make this a regular diffuse object, do just like this, just because I want to show you some new cool stuff. So one of the really neat things that they've added is in the world properties over here. If we actually have to change this to the final, and we can create a couple new things here. So you can see that there's fog and atmosphere volume. So let's ignore the fog right now. We're just going to turn on this atmosphere volume, and I'm going to set the density to like a 0.1, okay? And let's take a look at that. And it might take a moment for you to load this up, but check it out. A lot of people like that volumetric light look inside of scenes. So if you wanted that look, but you didn't want to have to render out a whole bunch of like uh, volumetrics that fill up the space, and it takes a lot of time and all that kind of stuff, and you want to add a fog later in post, or you just wanted that really cool lighting effect, and I'll turn off the overlay so you can check it out. You see that right there? That's our light. So if I take the light and I change this to a spot shape, for example, you can see that the shape has changed. And if I take the power and I increase this by a lot, you can see that now there's even more of that volumetric light showing there. And we can change the density to be a lot more, just like that, or to be less, to like a 0.01 or something like that. So really, really cool that they've added that. I do wish that, and you could change the color over here too, by the way. See that? Pretty neat. Now, I do wish that you could actually like do a super density, like make this really, really, really dense and go beyond 1. But right now, it's just set to make it to where 1 is the density as far as you can go. And with the radiance clamp, this is basically, how much it's going to clamp the light values in the background. So, you could set it to a 0.2. You can see how it made that a lot less visible. So a lot of cool stuff you can do with that. But be careful and make sure that you set this correct when you want to actually render it out and you get this set where you want it to be. Now, the next thing that we'll do is we'll turn on the fog here. And before, there were quite a few issues with fog. There were some problems with how it would render in the scene. But you can see here that I've turned it on and nothing has happened. There should actually be some presets in here, I think, when you turn it on, just so that everyone knows that it's not something wrong or broken with the render engine or whatever. But let's go ahead and just start playing with some of these things. I'm going to turn on the background here just so we can see what's going on. And for the distance, let's put 10 in here. You can see all of a sudden there's some stuff going on. We see this white thing in the background. And if we change this distance, we're not really seeing a whole lot going on. Now, if we start changing the height, you can see that now with the height, it's basically created a fog environment. So if we take that height and we put it down to a 1, for example, it's not super visible from above, but you can see, if I turn off the overlays, if we go down like this, you can see that there actually is, let's change that to a darker color so you can see, but you should be able to see a little bit of a change between the top and the bottom there. And we can take the distance here, make it 10, and now you can see it's even more foggy. So if you have just like a layer of clouds or something like that on a spooky street or something like that, where the fog is sort of like a mist that's on the bottom, you can set it like this. Now, as far as I know, you can't set any textures in here, but this is really nice to have for just some really basic settings, and it renders really, really fast. You can see that the viewport here, that's just 32 samples, and it's already pretty rendered as far as the fog is concerned. And we don't really have to put a whole lot of samples in order to render that out. And if we take this, we can actually change the color of the fog to give it a different sort of atmospheric feel. And you can rotate or offset the direction of the fog in any which way you want, or set the height to something like a 10, which takes up the whole scene, and it's like a big dust cloud or something like that. So pretty awesome that you can basically add an environment fog very, very quickly and very easily. And then on top of that, you can separate out the atmosphere volume from the fog. So if you wanted a bunch of light sources, but you didn't want to see them, you could turn them off. Or if you wanted to see the light sources, but not the fog, you can have them separated like this. So really awesome that you can have those sorts of options, and the fact that it renders so quickly. So a really, really awesome thing that they have done is they've actually updated how their interactive render mode looks at hair. And this was one thing that was very difficult. And I have a hair tutorial, so you can check that out. It's going to be linked down in the video description, so you can check this out. Along with I have a ton of these videos, you guys, so check those out if you're really interested in this engine. But the way that it renders hair is actually really, really fast in this new version. So what I've done is I've changed the render method to interactive, and it is so much faster to render. I mean, look how quickly it renders these strands. So I'm not going to do a direct comparison to cycles right now, but this is really, really fast. In fact, I would consider using this for animation if I had a character with a bunch of hair, because this is rendering very, very, very fast. Now, a sort of drawback is that the way that they have the principled hair, the direct coloring seems to work completely fine. I actually really like it. The random roughness, I don't think that the randomization is working yet in this software. So that's kind of a bummer. It might be. I'm not 100% because sometimes it says that it's been fixed, but sometimes it doesn't seem to have been fixed. But I have noticed that the principled hair BSDF, if you change this to the melanin concentration, in this interactive viewport, it just shows up as black. And I'm not sure exactly why that's happening, because if you change a bunch of the other settings, there's nothing really that changes. So if we go up here and we change the RPR to final, though, and we take a look at this, you will notice that there are some changes in the way that the coloring is done. So you can see that since the melanin is set to 0, that it looks white. So you can see how much like slower it is to render in this one. It looks a lot nicer, generally speaking. Let's actually change this to like a 0.5. Let's get this looking more correct. So you can see there's like a blondish color, and if I change the melanin or the redness here to a 0.5, we shouldn't actually see redness. Yeah, it just kind of like changes the saturation in the color. So the redness doesn't work yet, which is kind of a bummer. So they're aware that this doesn't work, but just keep that in mind. And I don't think that the random color is working. Let's see. Yeah, so I don't think that there is a random color or random roughness working, because I would imagine that the it's using the same method to figure out what the random strands are. So unfortunately, that doesn't work. But keep in mind that the direct coloring does work, or if you're doing the absorption coefficient method, which is what I showed everybody how to do in the hair tutorial series, you can make some different colors using the hair absorption method like this. So check out that video tutorial if you're interested. But what's really awesome is that we get this really, really fast interactive method of previewing and viewing the hair using a direct coloring method, which is really awesome. I mean, look how fast that is. Very, very cool. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to talk about a couple of the issues I seem to be having with the render engine, just so that you're aware of some of these issues, and that it doesn't sort of like take you by surprise if you're building something in here. So, one thing I've noticed is that the way that it handles textures in the RPR Uber, and just in general with this shading system, it doesn't seem to deal with the bump values or normals properly when you have something put into the roughness. So technically, PBR materials are kind of off the table for the most part when it comes to this. If you're using normal maps and roughness maps and specular maps and everything else, for some reason, and I've already reported this on the GitHub, the bump maps are not working correctly with the roughness. So, for example, if I take this and I put this into the diffuse roughness and I put it into the reflection roughness like this, you can see that we have a pretty neat looking little material that has some cool roughness values and things like that. Now, if we were to take this and put it into this bump map, for example, or this bump node, and we put it into the normal, nothing happens. And what it should look like is a mixture of what you're seeing right here and that right there. So, not sure why this is still kind of a problem, but hopefully this gets resolved soon. So, one thing I've noticed is that sometimes when I use a setting for the first time, whether it's inside the shader editor or if it's inside the world settings or something like that, sometimes the viewport will hang, and I don't know if it's building something or if it just needs to do that the first time you turn it on or what. I'm not really sure what the problem is, but sometimes it does take a while, like maybe even a minute or two, to like have this set properly. But afterwards you can see that everything's fine. If I turn off the rendered mode and I turn it back on, you can see that it doesn't really get hung up very much on the render. You can see that it starts up pretty quickly. So again, I'm not really sure what the problem is. Not sure if the system restart helped it out, so it's a lot faster now. But just keep that in mind when you're using this for the first time, that there might be some settings that cause the viewport to hang up a little bit. So save often and make sure that you just give it some time, have a little bit of patience, and it should work just fine. One of the other things I've noticed is that sometimes when you have this set to the final rendering quality, if you scale down something or you move it, you can see that it doesn't really update stuff properly. You can see that the scaled down one is down underneath here. And if I grab that and move it, you can see it's still holding on to that other object right there. You can see that it's technically not there if you look at the 3D viewport, but you can see that it's rendered there. So it looks like it caches your 3D scene, and then when other things are adjusted, it will kind of like keep that stuff there. So just keep that in mind when you're building stuff out, that, when you're looking at it in the rendered view, sometimes when you're changing the materials or when you're changing what the objects are in your scene, it won't necessarily update in your viewport, and you might need to use a interactive render mode or just reset, your viewport render every so often by going to solid mode and then going back to rendered. I'm sure there's a hotkey to just, reset or refresh your viewer, but basically just keep that in mind when you're building out your scenes and you're using that final render mode, that sometimes what you see might not actually be correct, as you can see there. So that's going to be it for this video. Hopefully you have either been, exposed to ProRender from this video and you can check it out and see what it has to offer. And for those of you who haven't really been using it recently because it might have some issues for you, hopefully this spurs your interest and gets you to check it out. Thanks very much to all of you guys, my subscribers, and my one member that I have on the YouTube channel. You can become a member and you can get some free downloads when you become a member. And thanks so much to all of my patrons. You guys are awesome, and it's really great that you guys help support me and the channel. If you want to become a patron, the link is down in the video description. You get access to basically all of the Gumroad project files and stuff that I don't release on there for free at a certain level. So if you are interested in that, check that out. Thanks again, and I will see you next time on DJ Tutorials.